So, such to be a gauge for how many times we met.
Jake, would you in the parking
Well,
lot? The parking lot? Is that what we're doing tonight?
Pardon?
Never mind. Find out one.
Today is Wednesday, March 24th, 2021. We will call the meeting to order at 5:33 p.m. Agenda item number 2 is to receive and potentially vote on a resolution in honor of International Social Emotional Learning Day. And Ms. Aisha Hall will present.
As Aisha comes up, I want to just introduce her to folks who may not be familiar with Aisha. So Aisha Hall is a staff of Lewiston Public Schools. She's also got children at Lewiston Public Schools. She's made some ground here in the community doing great work around social emotional learning. Her work as a coordinator is essential to the work that we are doing and want to continue to do as a district. She also has a strong focus, ability, and is doing a lot of work in and around equity. So when I mentioned the leadership work that I'm doing and the equity audit work that we're doing, Aisha is part of all of those pieces as well. And so she's mentioned in the past different work and opportunities to recognize some of the things that we're doing. And she mentioned National SEL Day, which happens to be Friday. Thought this to be a good opportunity for Aisha to be in front of you so you can have a face with a name again if you don't recall her or you're new to the committee, and also for members of the public to see. Aisha, take it away.
Thanks. So I just want to introduce myself formally again. I'm the Social Emotional Learning and Equity Resource Coordinator for our school district. But throughout the year, while I've been working during the pandemic, all throughout the pandemic, this is pretty much all I know as an employee for our Lewiston Public Schools. I felt that it was important to capture the work that we're doing, not just to say it out loud, but to have it in writing. And so that's where this resolution push came from in honor of International SEL Day. Last year, we launched a little information website, which up until now, I'm not sure that we were able to use it as effectively as we could be. And that's a lot of the reason for that is because of all of the turmoil and the transition that we've gone through this year. So I'm going to read the introduction or cover letter for you, and then the resolve, and then I'll open up if you have any questions about the resolution. I did send some information ahead of time to Jake. If you have any questions about that, I'm also here for that, and you can always email me. Okay. Dear Lewiston Public School Committee, thank you for your leadership during this challenging time. Given the nature and impact of COVID-19 pandemic on our community, the Lewiston Public Schools Social Emotional Learning Team respectfully submits the attached resolution in support of culturally responsive, anti-racist, social emotional learning for our young people and educators. The COVID-19 pandemic has impacted life for students, educators, and families in every community across the country. Educators and students are being called on to demonstrate empathy and resilience, build relationships across physical distance, and utilize their collective resolve to strengthen our schools and communities. These social and emotional skills offer a powerful means to support and educate each other. It's more important than ever for our local leaders to prioritize SEL opportunities for students and educators alike. Research overwhelmingly demonstrates that in classrooms and out-of-school settings, SEL bolsters young people's resiliency and sense of belonging, reduces behavioral issues, and increases school attendance and academic achievement. The Collaborative for Academic Social and Emotional Learning, CASEL, defines SEL as the process through which children and adults identify, understand, and manage emotions, set and achieve positive goals, feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain positive relationships, and make responsible decisions. The enormous shift to hybrid learning models has made SEL and the systematic implementation of SEL across schools and youth-serving organizations more important than ever for both students and educators alike. For students, SEL promotes skills needed to more fully engage in academic learning, whether in person or at a distance. For educators, SEL helps them practice self-care, resilience, and empathy while fostering safe, equitable, and welcoming school communities. Some aspects of our communities may now be situated online, but they should continue to focus on student strengths, culturally responsive, multi-tiered supports, and positive relationship development. Our district SEL leaders recognize the mounting decisions state and local leaders must make with finite resources. Our young people, educators, and families of all backgrounds must be able to engage in and access SEL education opportunities as we continue to weather this pandemic. The success and well-being of our community's next generation of leaders depends on it. To demonstrate a prioritization of SEL during this critical time, we offer the following resolution for the Lewiston Public School community to adopt. If you or any of our community members have any questions about the request or the resolution, please again reach out to me at ahall@lewistonpublicschools.org. Thank you for your consideration of this important request. Now we'll have the actual resolution attached. Resolution request, prioritize culturally responsive, equitable SEL. To promote student well-being and academic engagement during this time of the COVID-19 pandemic and beyond by prioritizing culturally responsive, anti-racist, social emotional learning. Whereas students cannot learn effectively unless schools are safe and equitable environments where all students feel a sense of belonging. Whereas students face increasing anxiety as the COVID-19 pandemic continues as a result of social distancing requirements and increasing social isolation, fear of illness for themselves and their peers, family and friends, uncertainty of their future in school and life, and financial insecurity that may result in hunger or stress at home. Whereas young people with strong social emotional skills are better able to cope with challenges, build protective factors for mental wellness challenges and resiliency from trauma, engage academically and experience long-term social, professional, and academic benefits. Whereas social emotional learning is the process through which all young people and adults acquire and apply the knowledge, skills, and attitudes to develop healthy identities, manage emotions, and achieve personal and collective goals, feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain supportive relationships, and make responsible and caring decisions. Whereas social emotional learning can be effectively integrated into schools and youth-serving organizations through classroom instruction, both in person and virtually, and other school-wide activities. Whereas educators with strong social emotional skills can navigate stressors, foster positive learning environments at a distance and in person, and implement SEL with greater fidelity. Whereas social emotional skills are both teachable and measurable and evidence-based, SEL programs have already been successfully implemented in schools across the country for students in preschool throughout high school. Therefore, be it resolved that the Lewiston Public Schools Committee encourages schools to implement SEL in both in-person and virtual environments and to conduct ongoing training of staff to ensure SEL implementation is culturally responsive and equitably meets the needs of all students. Thank y'all. If you have any questions.
Mr. Fizzick.
It was very eloquently put. I know a lot of time and thought that been put into it. And I like to say I appreciate the hard work that's been put into it. And then you and I have had discussions since I met you in person last summer. And so I appreciate this work being done. I know, all over the country we're a little bit behind. So I'm glad that we're catching up. So with that said, I'd like to make a motion to adopt this.
Second.
Mr. Majerus-Collins.
This isn't a question. I fully support this resolution, but I do think it's wonderful to be able to get this in writing and on record for the school community. I also want to commend the school committee for not just putting words behind our support for SEL, but actions as well. As some may know, Coordinator Hall, we're big fans of your work, and we moved your position last week from title funds to the general budget because we wanted it to be protected going forward. One of the few things that was a bright spot to come out of the council meeting on Monday was stated council support for further SEL positions from Councilor Pettengill. And so hopefully we'll be able to take that up tonight and demonstrate our commitment in a more robust way. But this is excellent, and I encourage everyone to vote for it.
Thank you.
Any other discussion? Ms. Wright?
I just wanted to echo the thanks for you and your team's work. Could you just tell us, obviously you were spearheading a lot of this, but who else is involved with the SEL team?
So I inherited SEL facilitators, right? They were PBIS facilitators. Then I inherited this group of folks to help me throughout the district. What I did was, I don't know if it's official, they can or cannot, but I made sure that I had at least an administrator. So we have assistant principals who are SEL leaders in their building. I have a mental health professional, whether it be a social worker or a school counselor, as well as that SEL facilitator. We meet monthly. I actually reach out to them frequently when we're sending out panorama surveys, for example, to get some feedback from our students. And we train together. So a lot of the 3 initiatives we have: responsive classroom, ruler approach, and what I miss, restorative practices. When there's training, that's where when I get all that information and all of that, the invites, it goes directly to those SEL leaders that meet each month, so that they are ready to be seedlings for the information for their school.
Thanks so much.
You're welcome.
Any further discussion?
Y'all know I love discussing SEL.
If not, Ward 7.
Yes.
City Council.
Yes?
Yes. Ward 1.
Yes.
2,
Yes.
3,
Yes.
4,
Yes.
5 is absent. Ward 6.
Yes.
Result to support that passes 8-0.
Awesome. Thank you for your hard work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If I may, just.
Oh, sorry.
I just want to add quickly a couple of statements. The work that Aisha is doing resonates, I think, deeply with this committee. You've already supported it in a number of ways. But I also want to share for the public just a little bit more information. Just for me, these are things that Aisha and Karen and Bobby and I and others talk about on a regular basis. But suspension and expulsion from schools has a serious impact on a student's learning. And recently, Member Majerus Collins brought forward something to limit that and to put constraints upon that. I think that was a good piece of work this committee did. Black and brown students and male students are much more likely than others to be suspended or expelled from school in general. There's a disparity there. Other disparities in punishments and the damage they cause have driven reforms to include social emotional learning, which Aisha's mentioned, and I think it's work we need to recognize more frequently. Educators' social and emotional competencies strongly influence students' motivation to learn and the school climate in general. And we talk about school pride, students' intrinsic motivation, extrinsic motivation. SEL is contributing to those factors. So what was that quality or skill? I'm asking you to reflect, or members of the public, what was the quality or skill set that the teacher had that you remember the most? And did it have connections to social emotional learning, how they cared about you, how they navigated the space for teaching and learning? SEL practices need to be developed among adults who interact with students in addition to the students themselves. I need to say this loud and clear. It's an area of passion of mine. This is not something that we train teachers to feed to kids. This is something that we're all doing. And it's bigger than a subset of standards that we want the kids to pick up. Or the students to pick up. This is work that adults do too. And we must apply culturally responsive leadership to comprehensively address the issues associated with student engagement. We've said repeatedly in this committee, all of you have, what are the truancy numbers? Are we tracking those? How are we getting kids back to school? We're getting them back to school with relationships. They're staying because of relationships. So the work that has started that will continue is going to build a better and stronger learning environment. So thank you for your time and entertaining some statements I wanted to share.
Agenda item number 3 is to review and possibly revise the fiscal year 2022 budget.
got some slides that I want to share. Please note that our meeting with the city was on Monday. I've been working on this material, reviewing some things that I believe are options. I know there may be differing opinions, but I want to at least share some options that I think are before us and invite a discussion and see if there's members of the public that also want to get involved. And I think what I'm trying to do is balance what I'm hearing anyway, which is a big challenge. And ultimately, this is educational policy. What happens with this budget, that as it moves forward from this body, will be the voting decision of this body. So I just want to share some information, some things that I think might help inform that decision. And ultimately, the controls, the ed policy piece lands with the membership. So the budget process remaining, at least these are the dates that have been set forth. We're hopeful to approve a budget at this level April 5th, and then it goes back to city on the 13th. May 4th, I'll present what this body is comfortable with me presenting and describing to the city council on May 4th. And keeping those timelines, we would have a budget validation referendum on the 11th of May. So we've talked a lot about what's not necessarily in and what pieces do we really have to have. And I think there's ways that we can get a lot of very good things for students. But I want to talk about some positive things that are in this budget as well. I want you to imagine the opportunity when you walked in today, or you drove in today, or if you haven't been by in a while, go up the hill and stop by the high school and take a look at the framing that's going up, the steel beams that are happening. And if you look at this picture, that's a beam that, landed in the elevator shaft part of the building is at the very top as the last piece of steel that was put up. And this was really a project that was about the kids. And when we blend mastery, skill, creativity, identity, and display the expression of the works of the students in any kind of learning environment, it's undeniable. There's something very magical about that. And while last week I talked about the debt service responsibility, I also want to preach to the public who are realizing that debt service responsibility, that this is an opportunity that's been supported for kids that will last as long as that building stands. What a great opportunity for our kids. And that's happening. That's in this budget, that's happening. And I guess I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up that while there's a debt service there, the opportunity and potential of that facility is undeniable. It's a wonderful thing for our kids. Other pieces we've talked about, allocating resources to language learners. We could talk about it, it's time, and it is, but it's something we've never really done. Not like this. That's a big step for our community. I'm proud to even be part of that conversation. That's a big step. But we talk about some potential budget adjustments. I know there's mixed feelings, but I want to share some ideas that are possibilities. I do believe that we can maximize federal relief funds that will reach students. I think we can minimize some of the impacts on Lewiston taxpayers, but again, that process is ed policy that will carry forward. And in response to an audit that happened last year, maybe not to the fullest effect that people were hoping, we did reduce unfilled vacancies connected to that audit. And I think that was a positive step. So some things that our plan does include as it sits today. Supports for language learners, maintains our professionals and the commitments we've made to them, opens new opportunities for students and community. As I mentioned in the slide with the high school expansion, it celebrates identity, creativity, and expression. It targets early interventions like never before. It increases instructional supplies due to the commitment of this committee, and extends the commitment of equity and social emotional learning for all of Lewiston Public Schools. The process to date, as you know, I won't read you all the slide. We started high, we made some reductions. We've done a lot of good work to put some things back in that people are very supportive of. The City Council provided some feedback. And then I went back to work with the information I had to at least present you with an option. The relief funds have come into play. We have more clarity on how we can use them. We know that, at least we believe we know that there are some funds that will be coming in addition to this due to the latest relief package passed at the federal level. And now that we know more details, which might have been nice to know a while back, but we know more details now. We've taken a look at how we might be able to use some of that, and in what kind of time frame might we be able to use some of that. So I want to remind you that this is a short-term opportunity. And really, we're looking at, if we take this disbursement of federal funds and what I'm about to pitch to you as an idea, could be sustained for 2 years with the relief funding. So the rules of the relief funds that are in use are being analyzed. Karen and I have sat, we've talked about things with Bobby. We've looked at the rules behind the funding that Karen's office is so actively trying to plan out. One-time costs are preferable. We've talked about this because recurring costs, they have a cliff. As soon as the relief fund money is gone, that's a dangerous scenario. So if we don't have a long-term plan for that, we could get ourselves into a situation where we're not able to fund what I think are necessities in a way other than some kind of funding that may not exist, or likely, I should say, will not exist. So we need to plan deliberately with the time frame available. I think we need to start remediation, address infrastructure concerns where we can. And I say where we can because of the permissible language of the funds. And in my opinion, do what we can to limit the local tax burden. So some categories that exist in those relief funds through the guidance: address learning loss. I can articulate a lot of ways in which we can address learning loss with some of the items in our budget. Preparing schools for reopening. Now, schools have been open this whole time. I want to be clear. I heard someone, the public, say to me recently, hey, when are you guys going to open up? And I just want to be clear. I know this body of folks knows it, but a message to the public. Our teachers have been working. Our schools have been open, and it's been more complex than a typical work year by far. But our folks are working. We're open. We're not just home waiting for the next step. Testing, repairing, and upgrading facilities to improve air quality. That can be one of those sticky areas. We have some big facilities ideas. We've got some things that we've asked for in the LCIP process. They're not things we could just pay and do. They have to qualify. So other potential items as we look through, whether they're new items or things that we believe will be permissible. But what I didn't put on here are things that we already have in place that are people. So when you see something like maintenance staff on the top right of the second column, that's the maintenance staff that recently we said we should reinstate that. That person's not employed here yet. But with the relief funds, we could employ them and have them for 2 years as one option. So this is a list of things that, again, are potentials. I don't like this list. I don't love it at all. I need you to know that. I'm just telling you they are options. But they are options that can last for 2 years. Instructional supplies, books, ventilation, additional space, technology, software, staff for targeted need, after school and summer school programming for remediation, social emotional learning resources. And I thought it was interesting that was mentioned at the city level, because we have talked internally, not presented in the budget, about using resource funds to bolster the SEL effort in our buildings with both materials and staffing. But it wasn't in the general fund budget, so we didn't carry that forward to here at this time. Staff training, which is a must. Staff are asking for training. We need to support them so they can be as effective as they want to be, and they do want to be effective, especially with these new platforms. Maintenance staff, PPEs, cleaning supplies, ELMS. There's 4 staff in this budget. That's a new thing that happened this year that seems to be working for some kids. I don't know. It could work. We could fill it. We could have it provided and have 20 kids sign up and have everybody say, I want to be back in school. I might come back and knock on the door and say, I need 2 more teachers. There's so many kids, we can't service them all. But not knowing that could be a relief fund area or item. Upgrades at Longley to expand the space and usage of that to support students in their learning. Student school access support staff, and also the floating nurses, which is something that we could fund again in that short term. So the FY22 budget draft, and I don't have these verified by Heather Hunter. Bobby did share a wonderful spreadsheet with me that allowed me to move things and see, so I had an idea of the mill rate, but again, I haven't had these verified by the city, so I don't want to carve anything in stone. But the FY22 proposed budget that I brought forward with reinstatements is estimated to be a $2.06 increase on the mill rate. FY22 budget with items moved to relief funds, and I've done some calculations and some looking at different items. I don't have these approved and submitted to the relief funds, but I firmly believe that this is a feasible, I know that we could do this as an option. Could bring us, our ask down to 61 cents on the mill rate. And that would include the reinstatements that were voted on last week. It would consist of about $2.8 million in reallocation. And again, this allocation could be sustained for 2 years with existing funds. And I know we worry about those recurring costs. So just a quick summary, a multi-year approach, looking at a 2-year window with relief funds and the general fund as proposed. We can create a growth of remediation efforts. We can provide supports to our most vulnerable. We can target interventions with staff, instructional supplies, and training, and open a new arts-focused wing at the high school. And I think those are some gains and some things that we should be very proud of in this process. I know that there'll be some deliberation tonight about some other ideas. I just wanted to share options with you. And before we leave tonight, my ask of you is that I'd like to proceed with making these adjustments. There's a lot here that we can work with and celebrate. Using relief funds is a short-term, 2-year solution, but it is a solution. I need a direction from the committee as a whole group. I need to know if I'm doing the work behind the scenes, especially with Bobby and the amount of work that it takes her to adjust for this 61-cent additional ask by way of relief funds, or if we're looking at the $2.01 increase, and I put plus because I don't know if that would be even more after deliberations.
Ms. Wright?
Can you tell us, just to ground this in, how much of the fund balance this uses?
So as it sits, this would leave the fund balance in use of the 5.9 and reduce the local tax burden.
It would use all of fund balance.
The 5.9 that was put in the initial budget, the superintendent's budget.
Could we possibly start the conversation there? I don't know if that might help ground me into this conversation, but I don't know if others want that.
I think that's a good question. So the budget calls for using $5.9 million in carryover unexpended funds. And that is another area where reductions can happen. So we could find a mill rate that might please the committee, and we could do work behind the scenes to find out how we will then, if we go with reductions, then reduce the 5.9 million of carryover use. So it's a scale there, but yes, it can be looked at for sure.
Can you explain again what the fund balance is?
Fund balance is unexpended funds. It's a carryover. There's a bit of a delay. So it's.
So that's like money that hasn't been used, it just keeps carrying over.
Right.
Carrying over.
And when we looked at the audit, we had those vacancies. Every time we have those positions in the budget, but nobody fills them, that money sits there. And then typically it gets used in the next available budget cycle. And so that's what that fund balance is.
And can I just add some city context if it's helpful for folks?
And I don't know, can I turn this off so we can see Logan?
Absolutely.
Sure.
So the city is planning to use, I think it's 2.7 million of their fund balance. And then they have a threshold where the ending fund balance comes in between 10 and 14%. So I don't know if we want to apply that rule here, and I don't know what that would be. And then I would say the other side of things that I'm the gears are turning in my head is that the city proposed a tax increase of 79 cents for the city. So the city thinks that's appropriate. And if that's our concern, then maybe we should target reflecting what they're asking for is a thought I'm having. I don't know if it's a good thought, but it's a thought.
I think that I don't have the screens in front of me now. I think that we added a significant amount of stuff back into the budget. And the feedback that I've been getting is that we're not likely to get city support at the level that we were discussing at the meeting the other night. And so I think that this is an appropriate use of the money that the relief funds that we got. And it's an excellent display of the district's willingness and ability to lower the tax rate for our taxpayers who are we're very concerned with our tax rate increasing as significantly as it was presented the other night. So I think all around this is an optimal solution with what we've been given. Mr. Madras, comment.
So I want to start by asking some clarifying questions of the superintendent. With what you're proposing, is there anything in your initial budget or in the school committee additions from last Wednesday that would not be funded by either the general fund or the relief funds?
We can account for all of those using those funds.
Okay, so this would be,
And if I may,
Sure.
there's some additional things in there too that we had talked about, summer school, after school, there were some programs to put back in, but we would have the funds to make sure that those allocations through the relief dollars do what we intended for them to do, to fund what we intended to fund, to make sure that it's all
okay.
encompassing. Other than maybe some of those reallocations that had numbers, there may be some decreases there.
So we're starting the conversation on the premise that everything that was in your original budget plus our adjustments last Wednesday, and then the items that that perhaps some of the items that were rejected last Wednesday under the understanding that they'd be funded through relief funds like the summer school item, all of that's funded. And under this plan to be funded for the next 2 school years.
Two school years.
Okay, so my most pressing concern coming into this evening was to make sure that all of those items were funded, and I'm very encouraged by the fact that they are. Now the conversation has to turn to how they're funded. And I'm appreciative of the possibility of using relief dollars to mitigate some of the increase. I agree strongly with Member Ray that under no circumstances should we come back to the city with anything less than what they're putting forward. And frankly, it ought to be more, because we cut last year and to help them meet an arbitrary goal of no increase. My main concern about this budget, as presented by the superintendent, is not that over the next 2 years it doesn't fund the things that this committee believes are important to fund, but frankly, my concern is that it sets up a situation 2 years from now where a number of important items are potentially left unfunded. Now, I should say that, hopefully 2 years from now, there will be a Lewiston school committee that is adamantly supportive of public education and is willing to fund those items through the budget. Hell, I hope there's a federal government that's willing to keep funneling money into public education. It's desperately needed. But I worry about that cliff. And so I guess what I would be asking this evening mostly from the committee is to look at the possibility of directing the superintendent to put as much of the recurring costs into the budget as possible. I think one-time expenses absolutely should belong in the relief funds. I think that pandemic-related expenses, and I also think that one-time expenses that aren't pandemic-related, we mentioned, for example, it's not to say that it's not pandemic-related, but the vision screener is a great example of something that has some tangential pandemic benefits, but is mostly just something we need. It's a one-time expense and we have some money to use, so let's use it. I get really queasy about things like nurses or other positions or sustaining programs being included in the relief funds question, because number one, I think it endangers our ability to recruit for those positions if we can't make a broader commitment than just 2 years. Number two, I think that when we're talking about positions that we all collectively believe we're going to need indefinitely, that we have a responsibility to put it in the budget, which is where things belong that are indefinite expenses. And then number three, it just to some extent kicks the can down the road for 2 years to say, well, we don't want to make a decision about whether local taxpayers should fund this year, so we'll let that decision be made in 2023. All that being said, I do want to emphasize that the most important takeaway here is that this proposal from the superintendent does support everything that this committee wanted to support. And now it's just a question of how much are we going to shove off for 2 years and how much are we going to decide to make the investment today. I'm going to be generally on the side of making the investment today, but that's on sustaining things, but that's a committee decision.
So I echo the sentiments of glad peer funding can cover everything that's well needed that we put back in the parking lot. I think from a lot of people in Lewiston who are really concerned about their taxes, they came as a shock. I think some people don't realize how much it's been tough on students and how much remediation that there actually needs to be. I think there's some people who are very upset how the Harvard model went and have a student in our Lewiston district and they want to see it done better and they just don't want to just throw money at the problem. So I think there's a lot of different dynamics that go on. I would say the city councils were actually kind of shocked a little bit. I would say, maybe I'm wrong. But I think one thing that the CARE funding does, if we do go with that model as a committee, is first of all, number one, everything's funded. But number two is we buy some time for some of our people in our city who eventually know that some sort of rate's gonna go. And it gives the city some time to work with that and to slowly build that into however they build it. So I think there's a lot of different things that I think is a win-win for everybody. And I understand your sentiments of the one-time investment and the recurring costs and who knows what the next committee is going to be. I get that I get that tremendously. But I think for the next 2 years, we know that we're going to get, our students are going to get what they need. And also too, we help, for our people who are struggling, because there are a lot of people out there struggling, we help them in the same respect that they don't have to all of a sudden this big, huge shock and increase that they have. But they know that an increase is coming and it can be done something slow and methodically instead of saying, hey, this is increasing, suck it up.
Yeah, so I'd like to make sure that floating nurse and any dyslexia training is in the budget, definitely, and not using care funds. What's it called, right? Care funds.
The nurses, we did itemize as things that we could do. The dyslexia training we left in.
Okay. So I would really like to see nurse, that floating nurse be in there for every year going forward. I don't know how do people feel about that, but.
I know we had discussion about one being in the budget and one using CARES Act. Is that, what you have itemized, is that for one or two floating nurses?
For this presentation and that reduction, I grabbed both,
Okay,
just for this presentation purpose.
just right.
Just to put some numbers on it, if we were to say the local tax increase for the the school would be 79 cents, is there a way to estimate how much of the fund balance we could preserve as carry forward?
I bet if you gave Bobby about a minute, she could figure it out because she's really good at this stuff. Bobby, did you catch that question?
Yes, I did. So 79 cents, I can
I
tell
can't
you.
hear you, Bobby. Hang on a
We
second.
can't hear you, Bobby. Are you muted?
No, she did.
No, maybe it's one of our records. Check that real quick.
Bobby, can you say testing? Or
Testing, testing. Can you hear me?
nothing?
She's lighting up.
Dave's checking, Bobby.
Yeah, hang on a second, let me double check. Try now, bud.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
I could hear me too. Are you still there? Okay. So it would require a $2.5 million reduction / cut. That gets you to 80 cents on the mill, and it keeps everything that you wanted in from last week. And then the fund balance, you'd have two options. You could apply that reduction directly to the fund balance and reduce the use of fund balance, or you could apply that to what is sitting in the local only column. In either one of those, the overall reduction would be a $1.3 million and change. So that's what you would save in the fund balance. Or you could apply that savings to the additional local and pass on to the taxpayer 1.1 and change $1 million increase. So
So
you have two options.
I was asking for the fund balance side, so we would preserve 1.3 million and use
4.5.
Okay. I don't love it, but it's better. So that would be my proposal. So 80 cents for the schools. We fund everything, figure out what's in, what's out, with the goal that recurring expenses are in the general fund, especially floating nurses, dyslexia, PD, and then carry forward 1.3 million.
Bobby, does that mean that we could get to 2.6, which strikes me as close to our ordinary number if we move forward with a $1 target?
I'm sorry, can you say that one more time?
So member Ray suggested moving to 80 cents. If we move to $1, would that then leave us with a fund balance going forward in the vicinity of 2.6 million? And follow-up question to that, is that closer to what we ordinarily aim for?
Give me 1 second. Let's see. So if you reduce the budget by 2.2 million, we can get to about 95%, or I'm sorry, 95 cents on the mill. And then that would leave, yes, you do good math, that would leave about $1 million in the use of fund balance, or $1 million in the balance. And yes, we would want to keep it around $1 million if we could. So again, that's a reduction of $2.2 million. Gets you to 95 cents on the mill.
So I just want to be clear, when you say reduction, you're talking about a reduction in the use of the fund balance.
Nope. I'm suggesting that you have to in order to reduce the use of the fund balance, you gotta reduce the budget. So you're gonna have to reduce the budget by $2.2 million, still keeping everything you asked in. The net on that is a little over $1 million. So you got to take what you're going to reduce tonight. If you do, subtract that from what you added back in last week. That gives you a net of $1 million reduction, which means that you can apply that to your fund balance and reduce the use of fund balance by that amount. So it's balanced. It's a balanced budget.
Okay, I'm trying to understand.
It's reducing the expense, so the fund balance usage would just go down.
So it's it's a reduction in the budget because you're reducing the line item of what we spend from the fund balance?
So look at it this way. If you make a reduction on the use of a revenue account, you have to make a reduction on the expenditure side. So whatever you reduce on the revenue side, as an example of the fund balance, you have to reduce on the expenditure side to have that balanced budget. And so the question was, if we got to $1 on the mill, what would that look like? I believe, Karen, and that's what you're asking. What would that look like as far as the reduction in the use of fund balance? Is that correct? And if I'm right, you're going to use $4.862 million in fund balance rather than the $5.9 million by making a $2.2 million cut on the expenditure side.
One way of reducing a revenue line is to reduce expenditures. Another way of reducing a particular revenue line is to increase a different revenue line, right?
If we had, you could do that if we had the revenue.
So
Yeah.
the revenue would be the amount raised in local taxes.
You could do that.
Right. So I guess what I'm suggesting is if we wanted to reduce the amount used out of the fund balance, and then we made that up in the local tax. And I'm saying if you move, the superintendent's suggestion tonight was 61 cent increase on the local taxes. If that instead was $1 increase, what I'm suggesting is that then we would be able to carry forward a $2.6 million fund balance going into next year.
If you pass the reduction onto the local only or the local taxpayer, you're
Yeah.
not touching your fund balance. You're not touching the use of the fund balance. So
Yeah.
you're still using 5.9.
I don't understand.
I think, Bobby, he's suggesting that instead of using the amount of the fund balance as allocated right now, and having a lower mill rate to the taxpayer, increasing the mill rate to the taxpayer and lowering the use of the fund balance.
Yes, that.
And my was 80 cents, his is $1.
Right.
And so we should talk amongst ourselves about what we're most comfortable with, is my guess, right?
But ultimately, I think what we're just trying to get a sense of is if we, under both the original proposal from the superintendent and under the proposal that we're currently at after Wednesday's meeting, both of those use the entirety of the fund balance. And Member Ray and myself, and I suspect perhaps other members of the committee, would like to see more than nothing in the fund balance. And so my personal opposition to any budget cuts would then lead me to suggest that the way that we avoid having nothing in the fund balance is to raise local taxes.
I have a question, and I don't know who to direct it to, maybe Bobby. And this may be a really stupid question. If we can meet the needs of everything that's been asked for in this budget and keep the tax rate down, why would we not do that? Why?
Why
I
preserve
think the,
fund balance, is that the question?
Right,
In any amount?
right. Why? I don't know how to word this, I'm
well,
sorry.
No, I think you're asking a question. The third element in all this is that fund balance. It's the unexpended funds that carried over. And Bobby, I don't know if you want to provide more context to the dangers of using such a large carryover fund balance and how it creates a shortfall later because you don't necessarily have it again.
So it's the cliff that I've mentioned multiple times that this budget has in it, and it's the use of that 5.9. And I'm not convinced that we'll fall off the cliff in the next budget cycle in FY23 because of our spending currently. However, we should be back in school and everything hopefully will go back to normal, whatever normal was. And our spending will be more consistent with years prior to the pandemic. And if that is true, then we will not have a high level of fund balance at the end of a fiscal year. That I project will happen in 2020 or the budget for 2024. And we need to plan for that. And we need to plan for that now. because Member Majoris Collins, a lot of what you have indicated over the last few meetings is those recurring expenses and how uncomfortable it makes you feel not having them in the budget. I share the same sentiment as you. And so we have to look at this, and I made this recommendation to the Finance Committee and to Superintendent Langlis that we've got to look at this in a multi-year approach, and we do need to develop a strategy on how we're going to, I don't know, even it out, if you will, in multiple budget years in the future so that we don't have a direct one-time huge hit to the budget, which would eventually be passed off to the taxpayer, and that's just not going to work. So it's a very long, complicated answer that I just gave you, but it's not good form or good practice to be using as much of the fund balance as we're using right now. But we do find ourselves in a predicament.
Do you have the numbers handy for what our fund balance was a year ago right now, and then what we carried over into the budget that we're operating on right now?
I can get that. I do have that saved in a spreadsheet. If you can just give me a couple minutes, maybe we can come back to it.
And
And
then
I'd be,
do you, I think you might have just answered this, but I want to make sure. Do you anticipate more money going into the fund balance at the end of this fiscal year from this current year? And do you know roughly what that is?
what did you say? What was the last part of that question?
Have an estimate of what that amount will be?
I'm thinking that it's going to be roughly what we had last year. I mean, when you look at spending compared to where we are in the fiscal year, we're down quite significantly in our spending, and that has a lot to do with the relief funds that we're using to spend to purchase a lot of the stuff that we need. So I think, you know, I mean, anything could happen if something goes wrong and we need, you know what I mean? Anything could happen, but I think we'll end up probably somewhere close to what we did last year. As far, go ahead.
Which was how much? Or you don't know that yet?
We ended at $5.9 million. And
So even if we funded this at the proposed rate, use the entire fund balance right now, presumably after July 1st, we would have a rollover from the current year that would replace that money. So we wouldn't.
yes.
Okay.
In my recommendation would be if we could figure out a way for next year for the like 4 years after that is to really look at the use of that and start developing a plan now, because it won't be there in the budget cycle after that. So next year it'll be 23, and 24 will fall. We'll hit the wall. I mean, it's a cliff.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Wright?
And so just to that point, so the fund balance policy for the city is to land somewhere between 10 and 14% of the fund balance gets carried forward. 12% of the 5.9 million would be what, $710,000? Is that right? I would have to do that. But
14% is around 800 and something thousand dollars.
maybe that's what we use, just that template that the city has used over time to just set that threshold, carry that forward, see what the budget looks like from there, like work backwards. I don't know.
I like a plan that meets whatever level of needs we can with the budget and also gives the taxpayer the most savings. That's what I prefer. As long as it doesn't leave us with zero money in the fund, or whatever is best for our students and the taxpayer, I think is what should be our goal, not what the city does.
But the 61 cents leaves it with zero.
That leaves it with zero until July 1st, and then we'll have another 5.9 roll into it. So it doesn't leave it with zero. Because
So
by
it's
the
an estimated.
there isn't a zero, right?
Then it leaves
I'm
with
not
0 and
comfortable with that,
24.
I would say.
Chief Avery, that's not a sustainable model, right? If we use the whole fund balance, then next year we have 5.9, and then maybe the year after that we have something, and then the year after that we have 0.
Right, and I have those numbers. You asked about, you know, what prior year fund balances have been, and so if we go back to fiscal year 15, the unassigned fund balance was $1.9 million. 16, 1.45. 17, we had $202,000. That's like 20 cents in our account. That's scary right there. 2018, we had 1.76. 2019, we had 2.5. And then, of course, 2020, we had 5.9.
And the scary thing with fund balance, so yes, the pandemic happened. Yes, we carried over 5.9. Yes, we're looking, at least as proposed, to use it because we have a pretty good sense that next year it'll be another large year. It's not typical. We have relief funds to float some things. We have some savings because of COVID in our general fund budget. That is not typical. And I think what Bobby's trying to emphasize, and I agree, if these were typical times, let's say this year, let's say there's no COVID last year and no pandemic related things this year, and we operated with the budget that was approved, we wouldn't have the 5.9 to even pitch to start this budget. And we certainly wouldn't be talking about it being here for next year. And so as soon as the pandemic and the relief funds start to go back to what things typically were, we want to make sure we have a plan for that third, fourth year out. And that's work that we need to be committed to do.
Mr. Adress-Collins.
I want to raise one other issue that does bear heavily on this discussion, and that is the fact that between now and when the superintendent's 2-year cycle plan would expire, the city is going to see a market increase in taxable assets with the CMP project. And this is a defining conversation in Lewiston city government and Lewiston public schools about what that windfall, and this is regardless of whether or not you support the project, there is a reality that it's moving forward and it's going to mean increased taxable property for the city of Lewiston, what that would be used for. And so potentially by adopting the superintendent's proposal, which offers a modest tax increase, potentially going with Member Ray's suggestion that we try to aim for the city's number. We can, along with that, send a message that we intend to carry forward any recurring expenses beyond the life of the relief dollars, and that we're going to do it by relying on the CMP money. And I mean, I think that's that the schools need to stake out a position that the bulk of that money needs to be put towards education early, or there will be people in the city who want to see it spent on other things. So I think that's something to consider as well. It presents an opportunity and a possibility that we don't actually have a cliff, but it is going to require the school committee, and not just this school committee, but future school committees and the administration to fight hard to make sure that the CMP money ends up in the schools.
Mr. Papa.
So let's go, Jake, let's start with the 2.8 million that you suggested as reallocating through the COVID funds. How much, do you have a clear number of how much of that is one time and what's reoccurring? Are we 50-50 split? Is most of it gonna reoccur? Is less of it gonna reoccur? Most of it's only one time?
Just going off the top of my head with all the things that
Just
were
a
10 months,
generalization.
24 hours, I would actually say it's probably more of a 55 or 60% potentially recurring and 40% no.
Okay. So, and you said that there's a two-year build out to be able to cover that cost.
With the current relief package, if we itemize it in that way, it will last us 2 years.
So we're talking about recurring of roughly 1.4 million over 2 years. So if we take into account covering 700,000 each year to cover that and get it where it's at, it'll be that. Do you have give me an example of some of the, I know you did the brief summary, but some more detail in terms of what of the pieces did you manage to shovel into COVID, some of the dollar figures that we've actually talked about.
Well, the first thing I did to avoid supplanting conversations, which is a slippery slope, is I looked at new items. So new piece of equipment, big and small. I looked at training that hasn't happened yet. I looked at positions that were reinstated that didn't exist prior. And I looked at a number of things, including software, the amount of money we spend on software currently because of COVID, but also for other structures that we have in use is over $500,000. I looked at some other adjustments in facilities that I think either can be paused for now and or potentially use relief funds for. Those were some of the big hitters.
Bobby, a question on the fund balance. What, in your experience of what you're seeing, what's a comfortable number that you see as reoccurring each year on a normal year? On a normal year.
Yeah, on a normal year, it'd be nice to have 1 million, 1.2 million. I don't think that we should have a high fund balance because, you know, the taxpayers approve a budget and they expect us to spend, you know, to spend that money on what's in the each article. But I do think that we do need to have somewhat of a fund balance, and I'm comfortable in Lewiston at $1.2 million. And having some tight, you know, really conservative fiscal controls over the fiscal year spending.
So you're saying after next year, when you estimate we should have a sizable fund balance like this year, that we likely expect roughly 1 to 1.5 million on a regular year fund balance to be there?
Yes, and I can say this, you know, we're in this budget, we've reduced a number of vacancy positions. And as Superintendent Langless had mentioned at the beginning of his presentation, by taking those out and knowing that, because a lot of the, I would say all of the prior fund balances that we've had has to do somewhat with the unfilled positions that we've had recurring year after year in our budgets. With this budget, we've reduced a number of those, and therefore that will not be hitting the bottom line in prior years if they remained unfilled. So yes, I mean that will have an impact on the unassigned fund balance in 2023 and 24 and going forward.
So being generous and saying we're gonna do $1.5 million in a couple of years, we got a $3.4 million cliff that we gotta handle over a 2-year span, which would be about 1.7 million to recover each year to try to get that cliff so that we don't have the big impact that you're talking about. So we got 700,000 recurring costs, got 1.7 million roughly to worry about a cliff. This state mandate that we did this year for the minimum, bringing it up to 38, there's still a second piece to this next year, correct?
That's correct.
What's that, do you have the idea what the financial impact, is it gonna be the same number as the?
Yep, I've costed it out. If everything stays the same as it is today, and we know it won't, but as of today, it'll be roughly the same as this year. And so in 2023, same, everything, to get to $40,000 starting salary, it'll be about $1.8 million. And it'll be a net effect of 6% throughout that salary scale. And that's statute.
1.8 just next year, or is that the total between the 2 years?
I'm talking about FY23 right now. FY22, the budget we're talking about right now is roughly 1.8 as well.
Okay, so that 1.8 there. And then, of course, we got our usual 1.5 million of payroll in there. So without even talking about this year's budget, 2.4, 3.4, 4.2, 5.2, 5.7. We're looking at $6 million next year without even talking about this year's budget. Is that, you kind of looked at next year, is that roughly a rough number?
I haven't, and just to clarify, when you say next year, you mean 23?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I haven't looked at 23 yet. It needs to be done. 24 needs to be done. 25 needs to be done. So I haven't. I've looked at 23 for teachers, for our certified professional staff only, just so that I know how we're gonna get there.
So with that in mind, I'm gonna go on this $6 million figure that we gotta worry about. Whether we're here or whether our next group is here to handing them that sort of bill. That is $6 million increase, without even talking about any additions of running a school department. So with that being said, obviously we need to have significant money in the fund balance. I don't think going with a zero is comfortable. I kind of agree with Alicia that we'll probably need to have about $1.5 million in there. And then, we got a lot that's gonna be reoccurring out of that COVID fund, so I would maybe take a look at putting that more in, going in Kernan's direction of putting those reoccurring into the budget so that we're able to account for that, and even though it may bump up the mill rate, it's gonna give us some flexibility depending on what the city council chooses to do, pending what the public chooses to do. I can support something like that because, again, I'll say it, the school department's 2/3 of the spending of the city of Lewiston. So we should be even with the city of Lewiston. And this is what's always handicapped this district to begin with. And that should be, we should get our share of moving forward. Realizing we're bringing it down from the 2. We're bringing it around the 1. If we can get $1.5 million, $1 million to $1.5 million, I think that helps buffer us on that fund balance next year. I think it helps us recover the reoccurring costs on the COVID and whatever happens with the state mandate next year and how our negotiations go. I mean, that's we'll have to worry about that next year. So that I kind of see the, kind of in the middle of what's already been proposed, somewhere in there. I think we should present it with as much of a tax increase that we can articulate and substantiate. Certainly I got blasted this week in my district. I only have one person out of maybe 60 that said they're gonna support this thing the way it is. So, I get it. At the same time, it's like, all right, we're figuring this out, but we don't want to strangle ourselves with putting everything in COVID funds and all this stuff. So a bump back down into a more reasonable number. If we got to bump it back down after the school committee or referendum, at least we got some wiggle room. So.
Mr. Majerscon.
My constituents had a different take than Member Potvins, but I suppose that's not a surprise. I guess my suggestion would be that we look to, this committee seems pretty well unanimous in support of the items that have been added to the budget, items that the superintendent brought forward initially. We want to see those things funded. What I would suggest that the administration do is identify one-time costs and COVID-specific costs and see what that number is. And go with the understanding that is all relief funds. And then see what it would take to put all the recurring funds, all the recurring expenses that we want to see funded into the general fund budget on a sustainable level, responsible way forward. The most important thing to me is to see that all these things are funded, but second to that, and it's not a distant second, is to make sure that they're funded in a way that's sustainable. And I think it's important for members of the committee to recognize that basically what's being suggested tonight is to use relief funds to paper over a gap, that we can do that for 2 years, and then we're either gonna have to lose a lot of things that we all think are important, or we're gonna have to do the tax increase that we had previously been talking about. And I think that the kicking that 2 years down the road is potentially a little better because of the CMP project, but ultimately not the responsible thing to do. And what I would suggest is for the administration to identify one-time expenses, specifically pandemic expenses, put those in the relief, and then put everything else in the general fund and come back to us with a number.
Sorry, go ahead.
I just got a question, so I want to be able to mull this over. Under your proposal, what was the mill rate gonna be?
Don't know. No, I mean, that's real, because we don't know exactly what the number is on recurring things versus the one time. So, you know,
And then I think there's other layers to that, just from my head. So books and periodicals is a recurring cost.
Yeah.
But if we can get books in place, it's not the shock effect year 3 because you replace those on a cycle. So some of the asks, we can actually acquire things this year that wouldn't be the full recurring cost, if that makes sense. So I just want to be clear up front, that if I come back and I say, well, I think we can do this here and this here, that, well, classroom supplies, that's a recurring cost. It is, but the way in which we've carved this out, it's not going to be this much every single year. There's things that we can do that would sustain longer than the year after year recurring costs at full amount.
Superintendent Langley, would that be reflective of the fact that the district has traditionally underfunded certain areas, and that this is an opportunity to do a catch-up, and then from there's a recurring cost, but it's not the cost that we would see this year to get back?
I think it's a balance between catch-up and opportunity with funding that's
Okay.
available.
Yeah,
But I guess I wouldn't want to sit here before you and say, we're going to use X amount of dollars in a general budget for classroom supplies and use relief funds for X amount of dollars for classroom supplies, and have you wonder if I'm trying to move something around on them. I guess what I'm saying is I think we can carve out some of these line items might be part and not, okay, that's a recurring cost that goes in. Some of it may be recurring, some of it is, as you said, getting things up to where they should be, but also our ability to secure things with funds that we don't typically have.
yeah, and I would suggest that breaking those kinds of items out like that is a sensible way of doing it. That when I speak of recurring costs, I'm talking about what a reasonable school committee that is strongly supportive of education would be funding for that line item year in and year out. I understand that there's an opportunity and there's also a need to go above and beyond on some of these recurring costs for 1 or 2 years because of the pandemic. But when I talk about recurring costs, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about what would be the indefinite value of this line item rather than what is the value at this particularly strange moment.
Our community has been hit hard in the last year. We were already not a wealthy community, and the results of the pandemic have torn our community apart financially. We've got people who are being evicted because they can't pay rent because of loss of employment. We've got people who can't pay their taxes because of loss of employment. And I don't view using the relief funds to tie up those ends right now as kicking anything down the road. I think that most likely 2 years from now, our community's financial position will be much better because we'll have gotten past the pandemic, the majority of the impact of the pandemic. So I don't view it as kicking it down the road 2 years. I view it as giving our community some relief because charging them more right now when we don't necessarily have to is going to be a pretty heavy burden for a lot of people in our community that I think they might be able to meet a little bit better 2 years from now. Mrs. Wright.
Ms. Whitlow.
Sorry, Ms. Whitlow.
I was like, I'm not ready.
I feel comfortable with what Mr. Potman was saying, and that's kind of my rationale and listening to everything going on here. So I don't know how we get to the next point of this meeting of like, how do we revise it? What do we have to vote on stuff? What are we doing? I don't know, I'm not saying we can do that right this second, that's what I'm saying. But, I mean, we can talk and talk and talk, but let's put something out there so that we can start doing our next plan.
Mr. Damon had his hand up.
Yeah, I guess, first question is for Ms. Ray. You said that the city's impact was gonna be 79 cents or something.
The proposed budget from the city administrator is 79 cents city.
And that is, the total cost of the city budget at this point is 40-something million or?
Hold please. A general fund expenditure budget of 50,757,797. 5075797.
And the current budget proposed by the superintendent is 95,000,008 something, is that right?
It's about that.
94,809,487.
Not with last week's.
But we also have to add the reinstatements of around 1.2.
Okay, so with the reinstatements, it's 95,972. Almost just under 96 million.
And if they're looking at, as Mr. Brockman has pointed out, that's virtually a third of the city's total budget, and they're going to push for their 79 cents. It would seem to me that, and I get it that, the city has to function, it has a lot of things it has to do, but it would seem to me that if they're going for 79 cents, we should be going for $1.50.
I agree with that.
Honestly, and I know that's a big hit for a lot of people, but on a percentage basis, especially considering how much we've been underfunded over the years, fair is fair.
Ms. Wright.
I take that point, and I hope you all heard me on Monday, fighting for this budget too. I think one thing I will say is that the 79 cents has not been workshopped. Well, we're working through the budget now, doing a version of the work that we all did here, and a couple things have been added to the parking lot, so it could go up from there too. I think I'm using that as a guiding figure and suggestion because due to your point, if the city council is comfortable with that on the city side, then they need to be comfortable with what we recommend on the school committee side, is my theory. I think, to Member Whitlow's point, I think the way I am thinking about this is I want 1.25 million in fund balance carried forward. Then from there, what does the mill rate look like? And I assume it will be around 80 cents, which is a bargain compared to the $1.46 that was initially proposed back on March 3rd. Bargain's a poor term probably, but I think that is something that recognizes, again, what the children of this district, the learners of this district gave up for the past year so that we could keep staff safe, and works at that remediation at a responsible level. I keep thinking, I understand Member Parks' point that if we could spare folks 20 cents more, why wouldn't we? But I think about any budgeting that I do personally. If I bought a house for any amount, I would want to keep some in reserves just in case. I can't support going to zero in that fund balance. I think 1.25 is probably low, but it's a number I can stomach. I hope other people could stomach. The tax rate, 80 cents for us. We see where the city lands. Their process is behind ours, so we won't be able to gauge off of that. But I think that's what's fair and that's what's equitable, and it puts a stake in the ground that moves us forward.
Mr. Driscoll.
I generally agree with what Member Ray said, except I think that the number is too low. I'm inclined to agree with Vice Chair Damon that, we should be looking at a more robust number there to mitigate the cliff later on. And I would also point out, and this is not our decision, But at any time the city council wants to provide tax relief to residents in Lewiston, they are in a position to do that with a local option, a homestead exemption. They can do that tomorrow. So, you know, the city council's moaning about taxes rings a little hollow to me when what they're really doing is they don't want to raise taxes in Walmart. So, you know, I don't have a lot of patience for that, because they could do that for seniors tomorrow. They can do it for everyone tomorrow. They can do a local option homestead exemption. Not our policy, not our call, but it's disingenuous when the city council complains about taxes and then doesn't provide tax relief that they could provide. But what I would say is that we have a responsibility to make sure that we believe that the items that we're funding next year are important. We want to see everything that's not a one-time or a pandemic continue to be funded even after the expenditure of the relief funds. That's going to require raising more revenue. I think that the responsible thing to do is to raise that revenue gradually over the course of the next 3 years, rather than artificially keeping it down and then hitting people 3 years from now, or relying on winning a fight with the city on the CNP money. If we win the fight with the city on the CNP money, then we don't have as much to ask in year 3. But the reality is that's what we should do. So I guess what I might suggest, and I would go so far as to make a motion, is that we direct the superintendent to come back to us with a budget that is 1.25 in fund balance, $1.25 increase on the local mill, and prioritizes putting recurring expenses in the general fund and one-time expenses in the relief fund, with an understanding that that probably doesn't get us to all the recurring expenses being in the general fund. But that's my suggestion and my motion.
Mr. Physick.
So there's been a lot of talk about the future and stuff, and trying to figure out what the city's gonna do, and there's no way to predict that. Has anyone just thought of just like saying, you know, I don't know how you would do it, but let's just sit down with the heads of the city, or the superintendent, sit down with the head of the city, and just have a discussion, because believe it or not, we're actually in this together. I know sometimes it seems like it's a us versus them kind of deal, which I can see how that's definitely how that can play out. I think what would be an important thing to do is to we're at a pivotal point right now. We're going to be coming out of the pandemic, hopefully. We've been gone through a lot of adversity as a city, and it would probably behoove us to actually sit down, or the boss sit down with the city, and let's have some discussion around some of these items, and see how that plays out. There might be a plan already to try to give us some money to CP. I probably doubt it, but I think it's worth to have a discussion along those lines of what can we do, and I know the whole thing about COVID funds, the recurrent thing, you're not guaranteed that these spots are going to be funded, and I understand that point of view. And I'll say this: the only reason why I really like the COVID thing, not only because it's funded, but is it gives chance to raise stuff slowly, and I'm curious to see what plays out with the proposals of when you go back and do some number crunching or whatever you want to call it, of how that plays out. But I do think to be able to raise slowly is something that a lot of people can get behind. That it's raising slowly, not necessarily like, okay, and we're going to keep hitting you, we're going to hit you right this from the get-go.
If I may, the city leadership it's been an open door. We've been able to have open conversations and dialogues. I think some of the newness of just elections and the cycle, it's lent itself to some good conversation, but we haven't done a multi-year plan yet. But I know for a fact that both the mayor and the city administrator, Dennis Dote, have been open door, willing to have conversations, and wanting to have conversations about these types of things, especially for multi-year planning. So I would echo that. I think everybody has their wants, but I also think that there's finite resources. But I don't think the city is the bad guy in this conversation. I think the school committee wants good things as well, but there's been an open door there, so I think that's something we should explore.
Was there a motion made?
Yes,
Was it seconded?
not so far.
Is there a second? No, okay. Mr. Poppin?
Bobby, can you do some quick math for us?
Yeah,
Yes, she can.
she's been doing it.
Well, hold on, please. Remember Damon? He can do math like he's a calculator in his head, so he might be better at it.
So what does it look like for the mill rate if we keep $1.5 million in the fund balance and we take 700,000 out of the COVID relief and put it back into the general fund? So don't use the COVID funds for 700,000, put that back in and 1.5 in the fund balance.
Is there a significance to that number, or it's just a number?
It's, the numbers I'm looking at is what's sustainable for us to recover on those costs, those reoccurring costs, and addressing the fund balance to have the buffer for next year. And I'm just curious at that point, what that looks like and then taking a look at what kind of impact that does to the taxes and maybe adjust it one way or the other.
For the purposes of clarification, Member Putnam, is the 700 half of what you estimate the recurring to be, and then you do the other half next year, and then by
Right, but we get the reoccurring in 2 years. So I don't want the 1.4, I just want 7 because we can handle the other 7 next year.
That's what I'm saying. So it's a 1.4 recurring, and your suggestion is to build the recurring into the general fund budget over the course of the 2 years, so there's
Over
no
the 2
cliff at the third year. And you can do that in theory by 700,000 a year.
Right.
That's a good plan.
And what was your?
So, I may be missing the 700, admittedly. If you want 1.6 million or 1.5, my numbers are 1.6 at the moment. I'm doing it quickly. Left in the fund balance, you have to reduce the expenditure budget by $2.8 million. If you want to keep everything that you added last Wednesday in.
No, he wants,
So-
rather than reducing, he wants to know what it will put out to the taxpayer, what it'll change the mill rate to.
Right, so my calculation shows that it's 65 cents on the mill.
I don't understand how that's possible if 1.3 was 80 cents.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Sorry, I'm jumping ahead, but 1.5 million in fund balance is 65 cents, but 1.3 million in fund balance is 80 cents?
No, I didn't say that. So if we cut $2.8 million, that leaves,
He doesn't
What is the
cut anything.
significance of the mentions of the cuts?
He's
because
not,
you have to cut to be able to get your fund balance,
But-
to have an available fund balance.
Nobody's suggesting cuts. What we're looking for is what would be required in terms of raising the local
moving
rate.
the things that are currently using the fund balance, moving those to the taxpayer. How much would that increase the mill rate?
Okay, I can't do that calculation this evening. I'm gonna have to get back to you on that because I don't have it set up that way for the local only. Because you're asking to pass it off to the taxpayer and not right? That's what you're asking?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't have that calculation set up.
Bobby, do you have a general idea of how much is 1 mil? The impact for 1 mil?
I don't remember Potvin.
So, okay, so with the presentation tonight, you had what, 66 cents impact?
61.
61. And that was,
Well, Member Puffin, you can just run this off of the original budget proposal, which was 146 on the mill.
Yeah.
For an increase of 6 point something, and then just,
0.99.
so basically 7, so 20 cents on the mill for every mill.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
what I'm looking at is you know, with the addition of the code, what we reinstated, we're at like 7 point. How much was the reinstatement total from last, from?
It's approximately 1.2.
So we're talking about 7.3 million, and out of that 7.3 million, you're suggested 2.8 in COVID relief funds. And that reduction from that 2.8 brought that down almost $1.40. So how much of that was on the revenue line? Hold on.
Bobby, I feel like the essential question is if we left $1.5 million in fund balance, don't use it. How much would it change the mill rate?
That's what I said in the beginning, but I don't think that was the question. If we leave, you have to, and I don't, you have to make a cut to be able to reduce the fund balance, or to member Majerus Collins' point, you have to increase on the revenue side. So to get I'm just doing a quick calculation, $1.6 million remaining in the fund balance. There are things you have to do that. And in this scenario, you have to make a $2.8 million cut, keep everything you added back in last week. That brings it to a 60.65, a 65 cents on the mill.
And so,
That'll give you $1.6 million in the fund balance.
so if you do that same thing that you just did, but you don't eliminate what was the number you said you eliminated?
2.8.
2.8.
So put the 2.8 back in, and then what does that calculate the mill rate at?
It goes back to where we started. So the mill rate now is 2.04 because I haven't made any changes anywhere now. Everything's back to where it was.
Back in, but not from the fund balance, I guess is what I meant.
From
And then,
COVID relief funds instead. Is that what you're asking?
So the relief.
no,
funds
this
won't
is
be
trying to
part
get
of
to the
this
mill rate that's
calculation.
gonna charge the taxpayer. So I'm trying to shift
We're not all speaking.
No, you have to have a balanced, it's got to be, if you want, because we're using 5.9, if you want 1.5 or 1.6, whatever, left in your fund balance, you have to either increase on the revenue side, and you can increase that at the local additional, or you can decrease it on the expenditure side, and that'll do it for you too. That's the only way I know how to do it, is you either got to increase revenue on the revenue side, and that's the local.
Let me clarify. Let me clarify. So Bobby, our present proposal is using all of the fund balance, using 2.8 million in COVID relief funds, and we get a 61 cent increase in the mill rate.
It was closer to.
Roughly.
So those three items, I'm looking at only using, instead of the 5.9, using only 4.5 million. And to only use 2.1 million in the COVID relief funds. What does that equation bring that 61 cent mill rate up to? So in the end, we're gonna have $1.5 million in the fund balance. We're gonna only spend 2.1 in the COVID funds. And that difference is gonna be passed along to the mill rate.
Yeah, I can't do that right now. If we were at a break, I mean, I'm happy to talk to either one of you or Jake.
Take a math break.
a math break.
Yes.
Can we
To
take,
add some
can we
kind
take
of
a
clarity.
5-minute break?
I mean, is that putting you too much on the spot, Bobby, to try to figure that out on a math break, or?
It's a little, because I'm not quite, I mean, I'm not quite understanding. It's got to be on both sides. I'm not quite understanding
I think, I'm curious, Ron, are you trying to get at, if you will, the director to the superintendent? We want to be here on the mill rate, we want to be here in carryover.
Yes,
Jake and team go to work.
yes.
That's what I want you to bring back to us.
I mean, before I say it, I kind of want to get an idea of what that number is. I mean, if it's $1.75,
That's not-
well, obviously, you know, we're already there at the 2, we're trying to cut that. But if it's 92 cents, then it kind of goes and, you know, what Megan's talking about, maybe alleviating as much as we can to the taxpayer while still trying to bump it up more than 61. So I'm trying to gauge an idea of where does this come out? And the 2 items that to me drive it is not to use 2.8 in the COVID, to use 2.1 so that we can recover, put 700 in the recurring, but regular budget. And that we keep $1 million to $1.5 million in the fund balance to buffer the impact of next year and the year after that. And see what the result is. So, I mean, I think the part she says, I think she's thinking, the way I'm interpreting what she's saying is I think she's thinking I'm trying to cut something when I'm not trying to cut it. I'm just trying to reallocate it,
Do math the other way.
you know, to shift it over to the mill rate, you know, and to understand that. So do you get what I'm trying to do?
I know what you're asking.
Yeah.
So, Member Potvin, without specific numbers, what you're suggesting is that we have a responsible carryover for the fund balance,
Yes.
that we identify the recurring expenses that are currently allocated to COVID relief and do a 2-year plan in which those get folded in half this year, half next year, and then there's no, then we've got them in the budget and there's no extra increase, no cliff in, that would be the 24 budget. And to do that over the course of the 2 years. So basically you're talking about a slight increase to the mill rate off of what the superintendent's proposal tonight is in order to provide a decent fund balance and to, over the course of 2 years, get the recurring costs all the way into the budget.
It's not gonna slide, I think it's gonna.
Well, I mean, okay.
Double the number, but it's somewhere around there.
Oh, okay. But so in principle, that's what you're suggesting.
Mhm.
I'm supportive of that. And I guess I might think that since that's a complicated thing, we may want to just have that be the directive and meet on Monday and see what comes back.
Miss Avery, do you have something?
Give me a Monday, we have anything.
No, you were looking this way, so I didn't know if you
I
were,
understand that.
if you had something
Oh,
to say.
no, I'm okay.
Miss Rick.
So, to the points made, I would have seconded the motion previously, which was to come back with a budget 1.25 million in the fund balance, but I did not want to commit to the 1.25 increase in the mill rate, with prioritizing putting recurring in the general fund and one time in the relief fund. So I think we're all saying the same thing, but we want to know what that mill rate is, and we're not understanding what this expenditure cut is,
So I'll offer another motion that maybe you'll support.
maybe.
To direct the superintendent to change the budget such that there is a $1.25 million carryover in the fund balance. And to identify all recurring costs that are going forward, and to ensure that half of all recurring costs that under his proposal from tonight are allocated to relief funds. And to, right, because what we're talking about ultimately is we're trying to get the recurring costs into the general fund budget on a 2-year cycle. So to do 50% of the recurring costs that tonight's proposal put into COVID relief, to put that into the general fund and to come back to us with what that would make the overall budget and the mill rate.
I would second that.
Thank you.
So just a point of order, there's no vote on agenda item number 3. It's just to review and possibly revise the budget. So can we just direct him what we want and then he goes back and works on it and brings it back to us without making a motion and voting on this? There's nothing to vote on.
There
That-
does,
The
that's
point
what-
of this conversation is just to direct him back, so we're just directing him.
there does seem to be disagreement though on the fund balance, right? So like we should answer
the question somehow, unless the superintendent's comfortable with just ignoring some of the advice that you've given, I guess.
I'm comfortable with the conversation as I'm hearing it. I'd like to repeat it back. Maybe I can get a sense of things. But I don't want to do this next Wednesday and have it shift again without the sentiments of the committee.
But it makes sense for everyone to go around to see what their, we're not taking a vote, what their.
That's something they'd like to see.
Yes.
But I have a point of order here. Number one, there is a potential vote on the agenda. Possibly revise is intrinsically an action. So that's changing the budget in some way. And then,
There is not a vote.
that is absolutely a vote, and I would appeal to the parliamentarian on whether revising the budget involves a vote.
Yeah, but I don't want to have this conversation. I would just rather move forward, but technically, yes.
But here's what I'm hearing. I'm hearing that the school committee would like me to go work with the team to find between 1.25 and 1.5 million that remain in carryover. Look at the items that help me get to that 2.8 to have tonight's conversation and try to itemize about 50% of the recurring costs and put them back in the budget.
Yes.
And then bring that back so that you can look at it and you'll be able to see what we were able to save from carryover usage, what the mill rate would be, so that we can move forward in the process.
I would be more comfortable with that, saying like, go do that work with directives rather than voting on it.
The vote was a directive. It doesn't adopt the
don't-
budget, and the budget as it currently constituted is the 95 that we approved last Wednesday. So this is a directive to come back to us with a new thing. It doesn't actually adopt
Okay,
the new thing.
let me put that in the motion.
Sorry, go ahead, Mr. Lee.
Press don't want to waste time arguing what's the directive or what the vote is. I just think is everyone comfortable with that scenario that we do this? I mean, I don't know if it needs I don't think we need an official vote, but is everyone comfortable with saying, hey, do this?
Yeah, I think that it supports us getting more information and finding out like what the answer to Mr. Potvin's question is and gives us a place that we can actually vote on the budget.
Is everyone good with that?
I am.
Okay.
I think we have what we need to do the work.
Does member Majerus want to withdraw his motion?
Has it been seconded?
I seconded it. This is on me.
Yeah, fine. I mean, I'm a little mystified why the committee wants to make decisions in sort of this informal way. It doesn't-
Normally in the budget process for the time that I've been on here, so it doesn't mean that it's right, but I'm saying what's happened in the time that I've been on the school committee is during these budget discussions, we come in and we have that. We have a discussion about it, we figure out which direction the school committee wants to go, which direction we want the superintendent to go and what they bring back to us, and then we ultimately vote on it at the end, once all of the discussions are over. I don't know if that's right or wrong, but that's how it's normally been done.
I mean, I'm fine with that informal directive. I just want to emphasize to everyone that right now, the budget that we voted for to have as the marker, and until we make a vote differently, is the
95,972.
So just so everyone knows, that's where we're at until we vote differently.
Right.
Yeah, I just don't want to watch them fight right now.
Okay.
If I may, I feel like I have clear direction. I feel like I have what I need to do that. Are there any other thoughts or items that people are curious about that they'd like to see Wednesday as part of that conversation, or are we good with that?
Sorry, can I clarify? Is member Potvin's idea of the 700,000 looped into that for a model that we'll see?
Actually, I think blended because,
It's the
yes, I have the
50%.
2.1s, but I also have the 50% of, I think the goal is to get all those recurring costs in the budget.
Yeah.
Thinking of that 2.1 and trying to find what the middle ground is there. But we'll be able to articulate that, I think, next Wednesday.
Yeah, I think just seeing a couple of the models would be helpful. I appreciate the work that went into tonight and the range, but I think having maybe three, like what's the low end, middle end, high end, right?
As a visual learner, that would be really good for me to be able to actually see it rather than have numbers flying around.
There was a lot of mental math tonight.
Can I ask one more clarifying question? I don't know if you have it, Jake, but do you have it with your proposal tonight, with the 61 cents and using the 2.8 and all that? Do you have the number of what the additional local allocation would be with your proposal?
Get it.
Because adding in the ask for what we put back last, we put it at $4.4 million. So I just wonder where that number is with.
It'd be 1.6. It'd be 1.6 because it's up. Take 2.8 off.
Do we know what the state's subsidy is going to be for next year?
As of right now, the state subsidy and the revenue is at 65. Tab 2.
Is that what they told us, or that's what we're predicting?
That's what they've told us. That's subject to change. The state considers that to be a live document until the budget is adopted. 65,353 is the general purpose aid.
Member Potvin,
Yes.
if we add back everything that you added last Wednesday, we'd have to add that to the additional local, as you just mentioned. And that would, to have a balanced budget, that would bring the additional local to 3.6 and change, $3.6 million and change.
Does that include the $1 million local debt service?
So they're broken out. So debt service is very separate than the additional local. So no, it does not. Debt service is separate. And I do want to add that it's not just the $1 million. I mean, we do have other local debt service. The total local debt service is $2.3 million and change. And $1 million of that roughly is the expansion project.
Just wanted to ask if the public might participate in this conversation before we move on from it.
I'm watching for hands. I haven't seen any yet, but if there's no further discussion among us, I will open it up to the public. If any of the attendees would like to speak.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, this is Linda Scott at 45 Pettingill Street. So first off, I know you all heard me comment Monday evening, and I would just like to say that how much I appreciate what the conversation has been tonight. I appreciate all the work that was put into this, and I especially appreciate Superintendent Langlay's understanding of what was said Monday night and coming forward with a proposal. I have to be honest with you, as much as I was worried about what was proposed Monday evening, in each proposal that was made tonight, I would absolutely support that. If we're looking at lowering this and we're looking at able to cover all the costs that are needed, I commend you all, and I really appreciate it. One comment I'd like to make, though, is I would caution you all as a member of the planning board and as somebody who has a lot of information on the CMP corridor and has paid close attention to what is happening around the corridor. I would caution that to be anything that you would think of as possibly using in the future until we know for sure that that corridor goes through and we don't have a state referendum around that corridor this fall. And I just say that as a caution. I would also recommend that you always keep something in the fund balance. And again, I just want to say that I really appreciate the work that's being done. And if you can do some of the proposals that are done tonight, I will be your #1 advocate in pushing this through. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other attendees? Seeing none. Agenda item number 4, to enter into executive session to discuss the
Can we take a break?
superintendent's contract. We can take a break while we're shutting everything down. To enter into executive session to discuss the superintendent's contract in accordance with 1 MRSA 4056D. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Ward 7,
Yes.
city council.
Yep.
Yes. Ward 1,
Yes.
2,
Yes.
3,
Yes.
4,
Yes.
5 is absent. Ward 6.
Yes.
8-0, enter into executive session at 7:23.